Hello, I'm Mike Truex. I'm the president of the 1904 World's Fair Society here in St. Louis, and Steve Schmitz and I are here to tell you the full story about the greatest Ferris wheel. In the late 1800s, large eastern cities had movies, museums, and big amusement parks like Coney Island. But in the rest of America, entertainment often traveled to the audience. Circuses, large and small, traveled the country by train, setting up in fields near towns for a few days of performances. Buffalo Bill and Frederick T. Cummins put on Wild West shows across America and even went to Europe to celebrate the vanishing frontier of America's West. But another type of entertainment also captured America's attention. The Victorian era World's Fairs displayed the products, culture, and art from countries around the world, and even put foreign people on exhibit. This picture is from the cover of a dedication day program from April 30th, 1903, which was attended by Theodore Roosevelt and former President Grover Cleveland. You can see some of the Victorian World's Fairs that were held going way back to 1851, and the U.S. started having fairs in the 1876 Philadelphia, really had a big one in Chicago. Europe kept having them in Paris and London. And then St. Louis came along in 1904. And you can see some of the reasons in their name that they were held to celebrate an important event, or the size of them, that St. Louis was the largest by far. In fact, St. Louis built a dozen large exhibit palaces, mostly out of wood and plaster, because they had to take them down. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the end of the fair. You can see the ladder going up, and the amount of lumber is just absolutely staggering that was used to build the St. Louis World's Fair. You could go on Sundays with a family to see the progress from week to week and just walk around the fairgrounds. Interestingly, I think this little boy has his box of Cracker Jacks or something. He's a little more interested in that than the building. So here's a view of the World's Fair, looking to the southwest. You can see the Grand Basin in the middle and the art museum behind Festival Hall. In green are the major roads, starting at the bottom and the main entrance to the fairgrounds, which is where the History Museum is today. Linda Boulevard going up to the left towards Washington University, which is off camera. Skinker going up by the Ferris Wheel. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get there. The Art Museum. And then over on the far left, the Missouri Building, which is where World's Fair Pavilion is today, and the Birdcage, which is still in the same place it was in 1904. Just to see what it looks like today on Google Earth, here's a view looking to the southwest with all of those same labels, including the traffic circle around the History Museum. But right now, Steve Schmitz is going to tell us about George Ferris and the Great Ferris Wheel.
Okay, thank you, Mike. My presentation today will focus on two key areas. The first being who was George Ferris and his life experiences, and I'll follow that by information pertaining to the Columbian Exposition and the Ferris wheel at its two locations in Chicago. I'd like to begin by saying that in 1891, when George Ferris was challenged to build his wheel, he seized the opportunity, understood the potential, and pursued it with courage and determination. This is George Ferris. This image was likely taken on opening day of the wheel in 1893 because on that day he wore a pink boutonniere. So who was George Ferris? Well, Ferris was described by those who knew him as being an astute businessman who had an engaging personality. That personality successfully won the support of key stakeholders by generating enthusiasm and confidence in his wheel. And most notably, he was known as a bright, optimistic, and hopeful individual, even during difficult times. And for Ferris, as we'll discuss, there were some very difficult times ahead. I think we can all agree that in many ways we are shaped by our life experiences. With that in mind, let's look at his formative years. He was born in Galesburg, Illinois on Valentine's Day in 1859, the youngest of 10 children. And these are his parents. His father's family moved to Galesburg in 1837. Soon after, his father met a Martha Hyde, and following a 3-year courtship, they were married. In their 57-year union, the couple had 10 children, and George was the youngest. Over time, the family accumulated wealth through dairy farming. They eventually moved west in pursuit of economic opportunities and settled in Carson City, Nevada. After arriving, they lived briefly with distant relatives and then settled on the open range raising cattle. Several years later, they relocated to the city and became involved in horticulture and landscaping. This is an image of their home in Carson City. While living there, George's sister Margaret married a gentleman by the name of Fred Dangberg. He was a neighboring rancher who had become one of the area's wealthiest cattlemen. I mention them now because they would later provide a financial lifeline for his education. And let's take a look at the education experiences of Ferris. By every account, he had a typical childhood, one that included necessary discipline. One source suggests that as a 14-year-old adolescent, he became a handful. And in 1873, his parents enrolled him in the California Military Academy in Oakland, a college prep school. This was money well spent as the school provided structure, military discipline, leadership training, and a sound technical foundation. These qualities proved essential when he graduated and pursued his next step in his education. And that next step was in the fall of 1876 when he was 17 years old and enrolled in the prestigious Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, to study civil engineering. How difficult was Rensselaer? On average, only 20 to 30% of each freshman class graduated in 4 years. Here are the symbols of his fraternity and the Rensselaer Society of Engineers. I mention his participation because in terms of success in the business world, it isn't always what you know, but rather who you know. And through these peer networks, he developed friendships and professional relationships. These led to rewarding opportunities throughout his engineering career. This is an image of his sister Margaret and her husband Fred Dangberg. I mentioned them earlier as playing a pivotal role in financing his education. They were helpful when George's parents announced their own constraints and inability to continue financing his schooling. They came to his rescue and funded the remainder of his education. George thus graduated with a degree in civil engineering at the age of 22. Following graduation from Rensselaer, Ferris had no job offers. He became discouraged and even considered moving back home, but was employed later that summer in New York City. His first boss was James Hewitt Ledley, who ran a railroad engineering and contracting firm. Ferris worked briefly as a transit man, laying out rail routes. With that job behind him, he began searching for his professional calling and worked for a number of employers before finding his path. On September 18th of 1886, the now 27-year-old Ferris married 24-year-old Margaret Ann Beatty of Canton, Ohio. At the time, he was employed testing iron and steel from Pittsburgh steel mills. In this line of work, he became motivated to start his own steel inspection business. The couple settled in Pittsburgh and started the GWG Ferris and Company, providing steel inspection and testing. The business matured and eventually grew to have additional offices in Cleveland, Philadelphia, Chicago, and New York. And this is his business card. In his new business, he had found his professional calling. He was finally engaged in what interested him most and was the most lucrative. He operated in partnership with 3 others, 2 of which were Rensselaer graduates, one of those being William Gronow. This is William Gronow. Just 2 years out of Rensselaer, it was Gronow who was challenged by Ferris to engineer the wheel, and he did so to perfection. In 1889, Ferris founded a second firm with Gustav Kaufman, another Rensselaer graduate. This Ferris and Kaufman Company was involved in part in engineering major bridges across the Ohio River. At this point, Ferris became active in the Engineers Society of Western Pennsylvania, which was a forum for meeting the best in the burgeoning steel business. In business, networking can open many doors, and Ferris was self-confident and sociable. Now we begin to explore the Columbian Exposition and the Ferris Wheel at its two locations in Chicago. In the April of 1890, President Harrison signed legislation into law designating Chicago as the host city for the Columbian Exposition. A site was chosen in Jackson Park, a marshland bordering Lake Michigan. Its soft, waterlogged soil would later pose significant challenges in establishing the 8 huge concrete foundations that supported the wheel. After the exposition was secured, Daniel Burnham, a prominent Chicago architect and planner, took on the role and prestigious title of Director of Works for the Columbian Exposition. In January of 1891, nearly 1 year after securing the exposition, he hosted a luncheon for American engineers and adamantly appealed to them to design an attraction that would rival the Eiffel Tower of the 1889 Paris Expo. He yearned for something beyond the ordinary that would make a statement and engage the public spirit. Ferris was intent on meeting that challenge, but faced constraints involving time and financing. His financing was secured through private sources, as the current state of the economy made obtaining a commercial loan nearly impossible. He also needed to persuade the exposition's Ways and Means Committee that the project was feasible. The committee had the authority to grant a concession giving Ferris the exclusive right to build and operate the wheel on the fairgrounds. Without this approval, the wheel could not be built. Another look at Gustav Eiffel and his tower in the various stages of completion. Now the challenge begins in securing the concession. Let's examine the events leading up to what turned out to be a full speed ahead decision. After the January meeting of engineers, Ferris conceived the idea of building a giant wheel. Within weeks, he directed his business partner, William Gronow, to begin work on the engineering aspects of that wheel. Once underway, the work progressed with momentum as Ferris and his team transformed the concept into a viable engineering design. This effort required the formation of 2 new companies, the Pittsburgh Construction Company and the Ferris Wheel Company. So with the necessary preparations in place, Ferris submitted his first proposal for the wheel to the Ways and Means Committee in June of 1892. Despite his commendable efforts, they weren't enough to achieve the desired result. The proposal was initially accepted by the committee, but that decision was soon rescinded. He returned to the committee again in November, roughly 6 months later, and resubmitted his amended proposal. Finally, lengthy preparation and allowed him to secure the concession, but approval wasn't granted until December 16th of 1892. As a result, just 4 months remained before the exposition opened. The construction time clock was ticking. The project faced many challenges as it moved forward toward completion. Some were specific to William Gronow, some to Ferris, and some tied directly to the state of the economy. The bottom line was they all had to be dealt with successfully. Those confronting William Gronow included developing a method for calculating stress points in the wheel. According to Gronow, this was an arduous task in engineering. Nothing like it had ever been attempted before. After a grueling 3-week period of hard thought and careful study, he developed a method and it was adopted. Another challenging task was the structural design of the 36 passenger cars. Gronow designed a means of attaching the cars to the wheel and determined their size, passenger capacity, and elements of safety. When completed, they each weighed 26,000 pounds. When it came time to drive the system, he needed to propel the wheel. He yielded to an experienced engineer, that being Samuel Discher, a Hungarian engineer who was responsible for designing the drive mechanisms and power plant that needed to operate the wheel. He chose steam power, the engines, as steam-driven engine can produce the tremendous torque that was required to turn the wheel. 2 of Discher's schematic drawings are now featured on display in the new new Ferris Wheel exhibit at the History Museum. So if you're attending, make sure to take a look at those. And Ferris had his own share of challenges. First and foremost, there was a prerequisite to making any significant progress with the wheel, and that was securing the right to build it, a goal he had ultimately achieved through hard work and determination. Other hurdles he had included unprecedented engineering feats like the giant axle, which is a story in and of itself. He also subcontracted the fabrication of countless parts to various steel mills, which were then shipped to Chicago for assembly. Coordinating this vast network of suppliers and deliveries was a formidable task. Ferris was fully aware that anything overlooked or underestimated could result in failure. Simply stated, he had his hands full. Finally, let's examine the challenges created by the state of the economy. Those challenges were the result of several years of increasing economic instability, which culminated in the Panic of 1893. That panic brought about bank and business failures, massive unemployment, financial panic, and investor hesitancy. Money was tight. I find it remarkable that in such an environment, considering all these challenges, that Ferris was able to conceive of this idea, convince his investors to back it as an unproven concept, gain approval from the committee to award him the concession, and build one of the most iconic engineering marvels of the era. Let's now turn to the fabrication of the parts that would be used and assembled to form the great structure of the wheel. The fabrication process was an extensive undertaking, given that the Ferris wheel was constructed from a reported 100,000 parts, and there were many suppliers for these parts. Work was outsourced to no fewer than 15 different firms. And Ferris, to maintain quality control, sent his own inspectors to monitor production at the manufacturing sites. The margin for error was zero. Construction was a monumental undertaking. The various assembled components were either purchased outright or custom made. Several key elements of the Ferris wheel included the 70-ton axle, countless fabricated steel parts, engines that drove the wheel, coal-fired boilers that provided steam to those engines, a network of gears, axles, and chains used to propel the wheel, and the plate glass used for the windows of the passenger cars. These numerous units had to be produced, procured, and assembled into a functional wheel, a task that required the combined expertise of two contractors. And those contractors were the Ferris-owned Pittsburgh Construction Company, which we mentioned earlier, who coordinated the financing, manufacturing, and delivery of the wheel's components, and the F.J. McCain and Brother Company. They were the contractor who performed the assembly of the wheel and who resourced the materials needed to do so. All electrical work and components were awarded to the Western Electric Company, and they were responsible for lighting the wheel and the surrounding grounds. So who behind the scenes contributed to this effort? Let's not overlook the estimated 30 to 40,000 workers who built the exposition and the proverbial stage for the Ferris wheel. Also draftsmen. They worked alongside William Gronow, preparing detailed drawings of the wheel's components for the associated steel mills and manufacturers who were involved. And let's not forget Luther Rice. Pictured here are Ferris and Luther Rice on the right. Ferris needed a superintendent to manage the construction of the wheel and bring it to completion, which was a major task. Ferris was well known and a friend and associate of Luther Rice and offered him the position. Rice accepted and was involved with the wheel longer than anyone else. He served in that position for 10 years. This is another image of Rice. The allure and appeal of the wheel were central to the concession's approval and to the wheel's success at the exposition. So why was the wheel so appealing? The Ferris wheel held strong appeal for two major groups. One was the Ferris Ways and Means Committee, and the other the general public. To the Ways and Means Committee, its novelty and potential profitability each played a role. Let's consider the following. The Ferris wheel followed the Eiffel Tower, which was a dramatic vertical attraction whose sheer presence drew millions to the 1889 Paris Exposition. The Columbian Exposition was seeking a significant landmark to show its grandeur and garner profit. The Ferris wheel's height would create a spectacle that would make a bold statement. And because the wheel could generate a substantial amount of revenue, the committee viewed it as a moneymaker. To the general public, it had emotional appeal. Rising 264 feet in the air by any means was nearly impossible. Achieving height was a new experience, and in 1893, the height in and of itself made the experience unique, exciting, and worth the 50-cent price of obtaining. Although the project was moving toward completion of the wheel, progress moved very slowly. During the harsh winter of 1893, any progress in construction was welcomed. Work began in January, but proceeded slowly due to bitter cold and frozen ground. The mean temperature for the month was 12 degrees. This is a rare image of the three key individuals responsible for bringing the wheel into existence. From the left is William Gronow, a Rensselaer graduate who engineered the wheel. To the center is George Ferris, and to his right is Luther Rice, the wheel superintendent. This image was likely taken around opening day of the wheel in June of 1893, when all three were known to be in attendance. You can also see the engines in proximity to these guys. And also this scene is taken in the engine pit, which was underneath the wheel itself. And if you look closely above it, you can see two of the passenger cars suspended above it at the time. As construction advanced, it became time to raise the 70-ton axle into position. Here we see the axle and one of 4 steam-powered lift engines used to raise it. It took 2 hours to safely raise the axle 140 feet. Soon to follow was the hanging of the passenger cars. The cars were attached in this particular configuration to balance load. More cars would follow as opening day was approaching. Telegrams at the time were frequently sent between Ferris and Rice. They were the fastest and most convenient form of long-distance communication at the time. Long-distance telephone service was in existence, but accessibility was limited, expensive, and frequently required the assistance of an operator. In other words, it just was not practical to use. In this example, on June 8th, just 2 weeks before the wheel's grand opening, Luther Rice contacts Ferris in Pittsburgh, informing him that the engines are working and the sprocket chains are ready to turn the wheel. The following day, there's another message informing Ferris that one complete revolution of the big wheel was made. Everything is working in a satisfactory way. And Rice offered his acclaim by adding, "I wish to congratulate you upon its complete success. The Midway is wildly enthusiastic." Work continued for another 2 weeks. And finally, on Wednesday, June 21st of 1893, some 51 days after the exposition opened, the Ferris wheel made its debut. Present was Ferris, his wife, and distinguished guest. The crowd of spectators was estimated at 20,000, and the surrounding structures were adorned with patriotic flags, garland, and bunting. From that day forward, the Ferris wheel operated every day, including Sundays, from 8 a.m. until 11 p.m. This image shows workers and Superintendent Luther Rice himself, which I've marked with a yellow spot. 2 of these workers included a timekeeper of the wheel who coordinated local loading cycles on the wheel and also monitored timed revolutions. The office guard featured here provided security, as cash from ticket sales was likely stored in the office of the superintendent. And that office was occupied by Superintendent Luther Rice. It was used for business and for performing wedding ceremonies, which in Chicago were completely prohibited on the wheel. A record 1.5 million patrons rode the wheel. Those who purchased a ticket chose to pay the 50 cents, the equivalent today of about $18. Children rode for half price. There were deaths, a total of 9 employee deaths in the 10 years of operation, 6 known in Chicago and 3 in St. Louis. All were associated with falls or injuries sustained from falling objects. Let's look at several images of the wheel. This image captures the fashion of the time. The wheel as seen from afar. A glimpse of the sheer size of the wheel. This is a watercolor that was produced by Henry Nichols. And now some statistics to share. The average per day ridership was 10,000 customers. On the 19th of October, during one trip, there were 1,784 people on the wheel, and that was about 83% of its total capacity of 2,160. And the largest number of people carried in 1 hour was about 4,000. Well, it's said that nothing in life lasts forever. Ferris had a successful 136-day run, and now it's behind him. The question now was what to do with the wheel or where to locate it. At this point, Ferris continued his search for a new venue. Following the fair, he met with stockholders and investors to evaluate several options. Ultimately, the stakeholders deferred the final decision to Ferris. He considered offers to relocate the wheel outside of Chicago, but all were rejected by one party or the other. So as winter approached, and with no new home in sight, the wheel sat idle on the midway until the following spring. In the spring of 1894, disassembly began and took 3 months to complete. And again, with no secured destination, the wheel spent another winter stored on a nearby railroad siding until the following spring of 1895. Now, it's finally time to move to a new home. Ferris eventually settled on a site 3 miles north, near Lincoln Park, in a community known as Lakeview. Lakeview was annexed by the city of Chicago in 1889. It contained a mix of affluent residents, German immigrants, shopkeepers, and farmers on its fringes. The neighborhood was transitioning from semi-rural character into a substantial urban district. Growth was recognized as a positive indicator for current and future patrons of the wheel. The wheel was then transported and reassembled there in 1895, and optimism prevailed. The wheel would remain operational there for 8 years, from 1895 until 1903. Ferris needed a convenient transportation system to make public access to the new site easier for the urban residents, and he entered into a partnership with transit magnate Charles Yerkes, whose heavily used cable car line ran close by. The plan with Yerkes was to transform the Ferris wheel into a money-making amusement district to be known as Ferris Wheel Park. Ferris had big plans. What he didn't know or anticipate, however, was the disaster that lay ahead. In the Lakeview community, trouble was looming as the proposed development encountered fierce opposition. Despite the opposition, the wheel was completed and opened in the fall of 1895. However, legal battles ensued over a variety of issues, and many residents feared that the enterprise would attract undesirable elements. So they reorganized an effort to prohibit a liquor license, and they succeeded in that effort, which was a major blow. The concept of an amusement district was promoted, but it never gained significant traction. And in the end, disaster stemmed from a convergence of 3 compounding issues: the enactment of the liquor ban, a loss of patronage and one of significant revenue, the impact of the national economic depression, and the reluctance or inability of many Chicago residents to pay another 50 cents or $18 for another ride on the big wheel. In addition, Lakeview residents imposed a damaging $50 per day license fee, the equivalent of $2,000 per day in 2026. The bottom line, the entire establishment was losing money from day one. And if this wasn't enough, the Columbian Exposition filed a lawsuit against the Ferris Wheel Company, claiming breach of contract. A judgment was rendered in 1897 for $84,000 against the Ferris Wheel Company, which again was the 2026 equivalent of $3.5 million. Let's leave the gloom and doom behind now and take a look at some images of the magnificent wheel at its Clark Street location. This is a fall picture, construction photo in 1895. This is Rice and Ferris by the soon-to-be raised axle. A rare ticket to Ferris Wheel Park. And close to the winter of 1895, to the right of this image is a still frame from an 1896 Lumiere Brothers film that actually captured the wheel in motion. What you're about to see is another marvel of the 19th century, a historical treasure, moving pictures. 2 French inventors and filmmakers, the Lumiere brothers, were widely regarded as pioneers of modern cinema. They developed a device called the cinematograph, which they used to produce this film. This was revolutionary. Motion was on the wheel, was imperceptible to passengers, it said, and the rate of speed was about 1 mile an hour. Patrons paid a 50-cent admission to Ferris Wheel Park and could ride the wheel as often as they desired. You can see as the cable car passes, the proximity of Yerkes to his cable cars rather, to the wheel. And we'll continue to look at that recording. All right. This is another look at the Great Wheel and how it dwarfs the residents that are around it. Here you can see the intrusion of the wheel into the residential district. You see the children on the street in front of the wheel there. Well, nothing lasts forever, and all things come to an end. Ferris's decline unfolded in 3 distinct stages. All 3 culminated in 1896, a mere 3 years after the fair. His business interest, his marriage, and his life. These were followed some 7 years later by the end of the wheel itself. With respect to his business interest in the wheel, in 1896, Ferris fought over ownership and financial claims related to the wheel. He was no longer in effective control of the enterprise. During all this instability, his 10-year marriage also suffered. In 1896, 10 years into their marriage, Ferris and his wife separated. She returned to Canton, Ohio, childless, to live with her widowed mother. Their later years were marked by unsuccessful legal battles, professional stress for Ferris resulting from uncertainty, financial strain, and declining health. And in the midst of all this strife, Ferris miscalculated his powers of endurance. In early November 1896, he became acutely ill and was admitted to St. Mary's Hospital in Pittsburgh. At the age of 37, following 2 weeks of hospitalization, with his wife at his bedside, Ferris died, a martyr to his ambition. The cause of death was reportedly typhoid fever. He was subsequently cremated. He had secured life insurance policies with banks to serve as collateral to cover his mounting debt. Consequently, his wife was left with nothing. She never remarried. The final phase of his demise came as the loss of his wheel. The wheel's decline also unfolded in 3 distinct stages. The first being fiscal strain, the second, its coming under receivership, and finally, the liquidation sale of the wheel itself. Fiscal strain increased as, beginning in 1896, the wheel was no longer financially viable to operate, and its continued operation would not resolve the debt. A court-ordered receivership was then established in 1896, and Luther Rice was appointed receiver. He assumed control of the company's assets and managed to preserve them under court supervision for the benefit of creditors. He did so until 1900, when the company went through another receivership, and an initial attempt was made to sell the wheel to pay off creditors. This attempted sale in 1900, however, was unsuccessful and led to the eventual liquidation and sale of the wheel in 1903, when a buyer surfaced. During the troubled 8-year period at Clark Street, there were several newspaper accounts reporting sales of the wheel, but none proved viable. The wheel managed to remain in operation under receivership until 1903. In 1903, under pressure by creditors and the fact that the wheel was no longer financially viable, Luther Rice made the decision to once again attempt to sell the wheel. And in June 1903, the wheel sold at auction to the Chicago House Wrecking Company for $8,150, the 2026 equivalent of $324,000. It was subsequently dismantled and would be operational at its third home in St. Louis the following year. And now I'll turn things over to Mike.
Thank you, Steve. Steve and I both found that the more we research the Ferris wheel, the more amazed we become of what Ferris and his team accomplished. The wheel came to St. Louis eventually after some negotiation. St. Louis, starting in 1901, when funding was secured for the World's Fair in St. Louis, and a lot of proposals had surfaced in the last couple of years, starting in about 1899. One proposal was in the Chicago Tribune to build a 700 or 1,000 foot tower like the Eiffel Tower. And on the one on the right, there would be birds that would carry 10 or 20 people at a time up to near the top of this 1,000 foot tower. Another person, Doak Adeloy, suggested making a giant 300-foot swing that would swing people up to an observation platform on either side. And 3D aerial globe was proposed to contain a large amount of the Ferris exhibits and meeting rooms and exhibits. They formed a company to construct it. It was a special, huge steel construction with a observation platform, searchlights on top. And it was initially going to be some 555 feet, the height of the Washington Monument. In a later proposal, it was going to be 750 feet high, which would make it taller than the St. Louis Arch. Unfortunately, it would require all of the steel output of the United States for 2 or 3 years to make and probably take 4 or 5 years to construct. So it was not a viable proposal. Or this company, the Chicago House Wrecking Company, had just purchased the wheel up in Chicago, and they volunteered to sell it to the St. Louis World's Fair, price to be negotiated, or to take it apart themselves, move it to St. Louis and put it up and operate it at a price to be negotiated. And after going back and forth, we guess at least half a dozen times, they settled on a price, and that allowed the wrecking company to keep a certain amount of the first amounts of revenue and then share the rest of it, like all the other concessions, with the Louisiana Purchase Exposition Company. And so at that point, they said, okay, let's get going on that. And that was in late 1903 when that was decided upon. So I want to take a quick look at Forest Park today in green with its landmarks around both 1904 and some of the things today like the Muni. And of course, the bird cage is still there. And you can see the streets labeled around the edge of the park. We're going to take this same map with the streets and show you what the World's Fair in its most common map looked like, with the fan-shaped arrangement of the major palaces, the pike on the upper northern edge, and then to the left or west of Skinker, the additional land, and we'll see that in a moment. Again, the major streets. And when we put these two maps together, you can see something that I've learned to tell people, that about half of the fair was in half of Forest Park, because the eastern half of Forest Park had already been developed with lakes and boating lakes and park trails in the park for carriages to go around, picnic areas, tennis courts, etc. When they first started, though, with half of Forest Park, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition Company said, well, we're going to need more land than that. So they looked to the west, and Washington University was already under construction to move from downtown into the Hilltop campus. And the LPE and Washington University directors worked a rental deal that they could use the buildings that were under construction for about $450,000 and for the duration of the fair and that land. That also included the gymnasium and the track, the stadium, etc. The large green areas that are shaded in were private land that was leased, and the orange area along the top, right along Lindell, was where the pike was eventually put. That land was not leased until late 1903, and it resulted in a lot of the pike attractions not being open until a few weeks after opening day. But they got their Ferris wheel, and you can see this view taken from the Illinois building at the enormity. You're almost as high as the 70-ton axle. Each of the cars carrying some people, although there's a couple cars that were empty. And I think that was a fairly common occurrence that the Ferris wheel did not really fill up at all at 50 cents per ride. Speaking of that axle, it took two train cars to move that axle with its flanges that the rods were connected to. And the rest of the 100,000 parts that Steve mentioned rode on 175 train cars from Chicago down to St. Louis. There's another picture of Ferris and Rice on the Ferris wheel or on the axle. And you can see the size of those flanges and all the holes in it that connected it to the inner and outer structural wheels. You can also see the rope on the ground, and there were 20 ropes that were about 1,000 feet long apiece. That's about 4 miles of rope, and I would guess those ropes were probably 3 or 4 inches in diameter, made out of hemp, extremely strong. Here's some gentlemen standing on the axle that's about to be raised. This is a picture in Chicago at Ferris Wheel Park where it was about to be raised there, but you can see the pulleys and again the ropes that were required to lift it up. Third time it was lifted up here in St. Louis, it took much less time than it did in Chicago when it took 2 hours to lift it for the first time. But the wrecking company, having taken it apart in Chicago and presumably labeled and marked the appropriate pieces, started building it in St. Louis. You can see one of the cars down at the bottom. We'll take a close look at those in a little bit. But with the construction going on, it allowed photographers to come out and take pictures. Can you see the construction workers down in the lower left where construction is taking place? No? Well, there's cranes lifting pieces up into position so that these workers can put it all together. And there's probably 8 or 10 workers in this image when it's zoomed in. In another picture, this was the first picture I ever saw of the Ferris wheel under construction. And it was in a book that was published in 2004. I got my magnifying glass out and I looked for the construction workers because I thought I could see them. Can you see them on this picture? Look again, there's another dozen or so construction workers up there with a myriad of ropes to lift things up, hold things in place so they could be properly assembled. How did they get up there? Well, if you look in the right edge, you can see a sloped ladder to get up here to near the top. You can also see down in the lower right corner rungs on a vertical, at the top of a vertical post that goes all the way down to the ground, about 140, 150 feet to get the workers up here. Those rungs, I'm sure, were very well attached because these guys were builders and constructors, because they had to climb up and down that 140 feet in the morning and afternoon. I'm not sure if there were any facilities at the top. As work progressed, eventually the inner wheel was completed, and now they're working on the outer wheel. You can see temporary platforms on the wheel that would support cranes with those long ropes to lift the pieces up. Can you see the workers on this one? I bet you can spot a couple of them. Well, there's 5 or 6 over here on the right and a couple lining things up. You can see all the little pulleys on the cranes, etc. Just an incredible undertaking to lift all of these parts up and get them properly assembled. A little bit closer, you can even see that the men are all wearing hats, and those aren't hard hats, nor are there any safety wires. They're holding on real tight. So once they got the wheel constructed, as Steve mentioned, they had to mount the passenger cars by lifting that 13-ton car that was fully assembled with its wood exterior, the strong windows, and around the bottom you can clearly see an I-beam that's probably about 10 inches vertical, and it went all the way around the base of the cars we'll see in a minute. They'd get it in place, and then they'd put one of these pins, and in the foreground you can see a couple of them sitting, but the rope is laying over one of those pins. It's, I think, 6.5 inches in diameter and about 6 feet long. And they'd lift that up and then put it through the outer edge of the wheel and into the car, where that car would then be lifted up into the next position so that they could put another car on it. And when you get all 36 cars on it, there it is, the marvel in motion. Now, in both Chicago and St. Louis, a lot of VIPs came and rode on the wheel. We'll name a couple of them later. And they would pay their 50 cents to ride the Ferris wheel, go up the stairs. And in St. Louis, there were 6 loading platforms. They could load 6 cars at a time with anywhere from 5 or 10 or 20 people up to as many as 60 people at a time. Here is a view in Chicago from a nearby building. You can see that one car is empty at the top, and other cars just have smaller numbers of people on them. Again, it gives you a scale of the enormity. Here's the great view of looking at the base and the bottom of a Ferris wheel car, where you can see the I-beams going around the bottom. You can see the entry door, and you can see all of the windows, and the windows would slide down a little bit so that you could get air, because the cars were not, of course, air conditioned. You can also see the bars to keep people from trying to go through the windows. You can also very well see the sprockets on the outer wheel and the light bulbs that are mounted. These sprockets will see how the wheel was driven, that at the bottom, the steam engines, through a series of gears, would turn this large geared sprocket with these wide gears that would engage this chain. And this chain would then, in the middle part here, engage the sprockets that were mounted on the wheel. And right here, this is the 2 parts of the wheel that are straight, and then it has those sprockets on it that are made to be curved so that they will match up for probably 15 feet with this chain. And that's what drove the wheel around and around, was this chain. Once you got in the wheel and were on your way up, you could look through the wheel at people on the opposite side. There's a car that's got probably, at least 20 people, I would guess 15 or 20 people in it. And on top of it is a car that's empty, and another car that's got some people, and they're all looking out, probably the far side, because all of these cables and rods are kind of distracting looking through, and it's a lot more fun to just look out and look down at everything, and we'll have some views like that in a minute. Here's another photographic view from a stereo view looking through the Ferris wheel. And now we'll take a look at looking to the south along Skinker Boulevard at the 20-acre Palace of Agriculture. You can see the tracks of the intramural train and a bridge going across Skinker so that you might not get run over by the train. There was also the miniature railroad train tracks that you could ride to go around the fairgrounds. Here's the view northwest towards Washington University. In the upper left, you can see Brookings Hall. Today, back then, it was the Fairs Administration Building. You can see the City Hall that E.G. Lewis had built for what became eventually University City, and it's now the City Hall. Skinker, and a lot of unusual architected foreign buildings. Looking up to the north, to the right of Skinker, you can see a few of the attractions on the pike, and you can also see the end of the Palace of Transportation with its 3 large arches. Looking to the east is probably the most impressive. You can see the Jerusalem exhibit at several acres, and then the Palace of Art, with its large sculpture hall, and then Festival Hall with its rear chambers for the organ, and the colonnade of states, and then the restaurant pavilion. And off to the left would be the Cascades going down to the Grand Basin. A lot of unusual events took place. In fact, on the first day that the Ferris wheel operated, a small wedding party got on and they got married up at the top. Same thing happened a couple days later, early in the week, and the Ferris wheel people decided, why not? It's tickets for us. So about 50 marriages occurred on the Ferris wheel. One marriage took place on two horses that were allowed to go up the loading ramps into a car. And one wedding party had a small platform constructed. And you can see on the left, and they got married on top of one of the cars. And you can see that same view looking at Festival Hall behind the wedding party. Famous riders included Geronimo and Alice Roosevelt. Two riders rode on top of a car, and I don't know if they had this platform or not, with Luther Rice all the way around. And then there was a daredevil, Belisario Cameroni, who hung a 1,000-foot steel cable from the axle platform about 1,000 feet down to New York to the North Pole. He had a small trolley on it with wheels and a leather strap hanging from it. And he would grab that leather strap with his teeth and come down from about 140 feet in the air all the way down to the ground. In this particular picture, he has a flag or two of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition flying behind him. The wheel was also illuminated, as we know, at night. And when we came across this picture about 10 years ago, we could see that one of the tracks of this time exposure showed a taller light, in fact, with beams coming out of it. And having looked at that, that had to be from a searchlight or a spotlight. And with some digging, we looked at other pictures and found a little structure on top of one of the Ferris wheel cars. It hadn't really been noticed much before or documented anywhere. There's that little structure again. And we eventually found that in 1908, apparently the Lakeside Amusement Park in Denver, Colorado, purchased the spotlight from the Ferris wheel and put it on top of their large tower at their amusement park. No, this spotlight searchlight is not documented in any 1904, 1905 documentation that we found to date. So I had to show this one other view of the Ferris wheel, which is taken from higher than the Ferris wheel, actually from a balloon with a very large plate on it, looking at the main picture with Festival Hall, the Palace of Art, the road going in between them. You can see where Skinker Avenue is, looking down at the Ferris wheel. They were able to Photoshop it a little bit. You cannot see the Grand Basin because the tall palaces obstruct the view of it. I'm guessing that this balloon was probably 350 to 400 feet high when this picture was taken. But as Steve has said, all things come to an end, and we know the wheel isn't there anymore. So what happened to it and the axle? Well, could it stay in place and make a new amusement park? And the local people said no. And the LPE contract in the St. Louis Ordinance required its removal for the restoration of Forest Park. So can they sell it and move it to another amusement park? Well, Coney Island got into initial negotiation, and even though they could make their money back in 2 years, they declined, and the Forest Park Highlands declined. So they knew that it was worthwhile as scrap. In 1906, it was valued at some $77,000. The axle alone was worth over $1,000 estimated because of the 70 tons. That's about $30,000 today. That was apparently the only alternative. And so this great, beautiful Ferris wheel, after the cars were taken off, in this picture I like to call the lonely Ferris wheel, with most of the fair demolished and gone, one facade of one building there. And the small building in front of the Ferris wheel is the life-saving building. And if you look faintly in the distance, there's the Palace of Art on top of Art Hill. Everything else is pretty much gone. And in May 1906, the woman pushed the button and the Ferris wheel was blown up and destroyed. There's a drawing basically from a photograph, we believe. And then another photograph image that Steve just recently came across. It shows the Ferris wheel in the process of falling to the ground. And when it did, it made a huge pile of debris. But it was a lot easier and faster for them to go in and cut this up, put it on train cars, and take it away for melting down and salvage. People came out apparently for a couple of days or weeks maybe to take pictures of themselves in front of the pile. There's a couple of younger boys there probably being told don't go anywhere, don't go any closer than that, showing one of the large gears that drove this Ferris wheel. And of course, with the horse carriage off to the left and horse, a little hard to make out, but the axle of the Ferris wheel fell sideways and kind of embedded itself partway into the ground, dragging everything down with it. But the Chicago House Wrecking Company had salvaged World's Fairs before. They estimated that the $50 million was built to build the World's Fair Exposition, and they published catalogs about the same size as a National Geographic, selling lumber, selling toilets, selling lumber, selling windows, selling lumber, selling hinges. I said that pipe, light bulbs, selling lumber. And I like to think that any house built in the next couple of years after the fair within 30 miles of St. Louis could have reasonably some lumber from the World's Fair in it. And then the remaining question that didn't take long to come up after 1906 when the wheel was destroyed is what happened to the axle? There's 4 or 5 places that people thought the axle could have just been left behind because a lot of people thought it was too heavy to move. Well, wait a minute. Didn't we say that it was moved by the wrecking company from Chicago down here? We did. That's documented very clearly. But those are some of the places that over the course of the next 20 years, going into World War II, that people were looking for that Ferris wheel and that axle. In 1943, George Jones did a dig in Forest Park and found one of the nuts. He had been a construction worker on the Ferris wheel. And he's also holding up a large sheet of steel with a few holes in it that is probably from the Ferris wheel. In 1965, the Post-Dispatch published an article about, that it was supposedly buried in the park somewhere. In 1997, there was a lot of research into trying to find out where it went. And some digs took place in conjunction with some utility digs to find that axle. And they kind of thought they found it, but in fact, after further digging, at least according to one of the people involved in this effort, they found a big long lead pipe. Another person got to the newspaper, submitted a newspaper that said one of my grandfather purchased it and he ran a company and he had it broken up into pieces and hauled away. The problem was back in 1906, torches were just getting strong enough to cut it up. And they thought it would be worth more money. And the wrecking company was a salvage company, remember. In 2007, Sheldon Briner did a cesium magnetometer study and allegedly found a long piece of metal under Skinker, right at Y down. And then one more person was doing a dig for a concrete fence out at Whiteown School, about a half a mile away, and came across this big piece of steel that he decided to work around rather than try to dig it up. And he thought that must have been the axle. But keep in mind that axle was worth over $1,000 back then. It had been previously moved 3 times, so it wasn't too heavy to move. Tracks were still in place, so that wouldn't have been newsworthy. And there's a lot of documentation that I'd like to tell you about that it indicates that the Ferris wheel went back to Chicago, the Ferris wheel axle. In 1992, Norman Anderson wrote a book and talked with Eleanor Harris, the daughter of the head of the company, who recalled the company's yards having the axle in it for several years after the World's Fair, and it was eventually cut up for scrap. Leo Harris, the son or grandson of one of the owners of the Chicago House Wrecking Company, in October 1999 published an article that the 93,000-pound main shaft of hardened steel was shipped on 2 wrecking flat cars up to Chicago. And it stayed there until 1918 when it was eventually cut up and sold for scrap. Another 1951 letter from Reardon to Mortimer Harris, 2 officers in the Harris Company or the Chicago House Wrecking Company, says almost the same thing, that it was shipped back to Chicago because it was hardening. It was shipped on 2 flat cars and kept up there when the acetylene torches eventually cut it up and sold it for scrap. And then finally, in the past 4 or 5 years, Steve has found a couple of newspaper articles in the Globe Democrat, December 30th, 1906, and then about a month later, it was also printed in the Clinton, Illinois Register that the last of the Ferris wheel was taken away. The axle was pulled from its resting place. It was found necessary to blow the flanges off before it could be loaded onto the car. And obviously, they're talking about railroad cars to take it back to Chicago. And so we are 99% convinced that it went back to Chicago because of all that documentation. Now, I'd like to briefly tell you about some of the memorabilia and legacies of the fair. In Chicago, in particular, some very good artists did very good artwork to show you what the Ferris wheel looked like during that fair's 5-month run. A couple of novels have used the Ferris wheel as key points in their novels. In fact, there have been several novels written in the last 4 or 5 years that all include the St. Louis World's Fair, various amusements, and the Ferris wheel. One of Steve's treasured souvenirs from the World's Columbian Exposition is a visitor's certificate to ride on the Ferris wheel. Some souvenir booklets were made from both Chicago and St. Louis in 1893 and 1904. Paperweights were made from both World's Fairs. Chicago published a recipe book, and St. Louis published or manufactured a small egg-shaped and sized candy container. A souvenir spoon from St. Louis and a souvenir token from Chicago. If you find one of these, let me know. And then a tape measure from St. Louis had a picture of the Ferris wheel on it. Interestingly, that photograph that's on it with Jefferson and Napoleon on one side, this photograph is actually from Chicago, as is this color one, where it says Observation Wheel St. Louis 1904, is actually has a Chicago building in it. Music was inspired by the wheel to include marches, a waltz, a march and 2-step, and then a waltz and polka. And the Victorians very quickly seized upon what Ferris had made at 250 feet. And for a sense of scale, there's several Ferris wheels in Paris, Vienna, London, and Blackpool that were in the 250-foot range. Some were bigger and some were smaller, but none of them had cars nearly as big that could hold up to 60 people. Even today, giant Ferris wheels have been made up at 400 feet in various cities around the world. And the record holder, I think, was Las Vegas for a little while at 550 feet. But more recently, in 2022, Dubai has finished off a Ferris wheel at 820 feet, 48 cabins that can hold 35 people apiece. That's about 1,700 people. Still not quite as many people as 1904. St. Louis has always had some wheels, though. Colossus out at Six Flags, which came from the 1984 Louisiana World's Fair. We had one in Forest Park for the Centennial. And there's a smaller Ferris wheel on top of the City Museum, but keep in mind that it's 13 stories high, so that's probably 160 or 70 feet high. And now we've got a Ferris wheel down at Union Station that's about 200 feet tall. The cars will hold 6 to 8 people if you squeeze. And it's about 200 feet tall. It'll carry a few hundred people at a time. And you get to go around a few times. It has fantastical LED lighting that's always changing, and etc. Of course, people like to make their own Ferris wheels, and somebody made a Ferris wheel replica out of a couple of bicycle wheels about 20 years ago. Erector sets were sold going back to the 1950s and 60s. The American Model Builders built one that's on display in the Ferris wheel room now. It's about, I'd guess close to 3 feet in diameter. Very, very accurate with the red support towers, the axle, and the cars. And then someone in Europe built a 21-foot tall Ferris wheel that Ripley's, believe it or not, was able to procure. And they built a special building to show it off down in St. Augustine, Florida. It is truly a thing of beauty, and it's too bad it wasn't kept around. I imagine it would have lasted 120 years without any problem with just minimal maintenance. But we want to keep the memories alive of the World's Fair, and if you have a chance to go down to Union Station and ride the Ferris wheel down there, remember, it's a neat Ferris wheel. It's not as big or as tall, but it's still a very neat ride. And that concludes the presentation about the greatest Ferris wheel from 2 World's Fairs. Thanks for watching.